Welcome everybody to Political Science 110 Objective F. Today we will begin our discussion of the structure and powers of the three branches of government. We will begin today with Congress, which is the branch of the federal government that many people feel to be the most powerful, and today we will see why some people believe that. We begin, though, with a discussion of the jobs of a member of Congress. Members of Congress have kind of a complicated role. First, they're supposed to represent the people who elected them. So if you are the senator, one of the two senators from Ohio, you are supposed to help out the people in Ohio. You are supposed to represent them. If you are the representative in the House of Representatives from the Cleveland area, you should be representing the interests of those citizens of the Cleveland area. So you will do things like try to get projects and money sent to your district or sent to your state. Now this may come into conflict with the other jobs of a member of Congress. Importantly, the lawmaking function. If you are a member of Congress, you are not only supposed to serve the people back home, you are also supposed to serve all Americans. You are supposed to make decisions that will help everyone in the country. But sometimes you trying to help out the people back home means you are not helping members of the entire country. This conflict, it will provide very serious consequences for our democracy. Lastly, and the third role here is what we call partisanship. If you are partisan, it means that you are loyal to your political party. So here we're talking in the United States about Republicans and Democrats. If you're a very serious partisan, that means that you will do what's best for the political party because they are the ones that also help get you elected. You will do what you can to help the party, and you may care less about the interests of the entire nation, or you might care less about the interests of the people back home because you are trying to help out your political party. So as you can see, being a member of Congress is rather complicated, and it's hard sometimes for members of Congress to figure out where they fit in terms of these different roles that they play. And sometimes it's very difficult, especially, to balance the idea that you're supposed to be helping out the country, but at the same time you're supposed to be helping out the people back home. It is going to help get you elected if you can get federal money given to your local district or your local state. Because then when you're trying to get elected, you can say, hey, people of Ohio, look at me. I help create X number of jobs. I help bring X millions of dollars of federal money to Ohio. Elect me again. This goes part of the way towards explaining why Americans generally hate Congress. We have a very low regard for what Congress does, but we tend to like our own senators and representatives. So if you ask Americans, do you like your current senator? Most of them will say yes. When you ask them, do you like Congress? The vast majority will say no. So that's a conflict that you'll see play out in a lot of congressional politics. Partisanship really is at the heart of a lot of our political breakdowns. Members of Congress need to juggle their commitment to the party with the need to represent voters. But what's happened in the past 30, 40 years is that the political parties have gotten very polarized, meaning they're really sticking to their guns and they're really moving farther apart from one another. And this means that it's very hard if you are a Republican to work with a Democrat, and it's very difficult if you're a Democrat to work with a Republican. This leads us to deeply polarizing, highly cynical politics that we sometimes call hyper-partisanship, where your commitment to your party is so strong that you will just do whatever you can to protect the political party, and you won't really think about the voters back home. This obviously makes members of Congress very unpopular, and if generally speaking, if members of Congress get to be too partisan, they will begin to suffer and they may not be reelected. If you take a look here at this graph, this is figure 7.7 from your book. You see the polarization of the parties in Congress. The red lines are the conservative Republicans. The blue lines are the liberal Democrats. Now, if you look, those two sets of lines are closest in the years about 1939 to 1949. Obviously, World War II is happening then. After World War II, the distance between those two lines grows and grows and grows to the point where now there's a really big difference between a conservative Republican and a liberal Democrat. So much so that it is almost impossible for those groups to work together. This has led to our government being shut down effectively, where the Congress year after year does less and less because they cannot get over their ideological differences. Here you see another interesting graph that goes along with figure 7.7. This is the percentage of times that members of Congress will vote with their party. So number of times that the Democrats or Republicans will vote with the majority of their fellow Republicans or Democrats. So if you look, that has been going up since 1970, where in 1970 about half of the time and about 60% of the time for Republicans, they would vote just whatever they felt. But now if you fast forward to 2011, 2012, 90% of the time, all the Democrats vote the same and all the Republicans vote the same. That means that if you are a Republican or a Democrat in Congress, there's a lot of pressure on you to toe the party line, vote how the party wants you to vote, and there's not a lot of room for you to think freely. In 2011, only about 10% of Republicans or Democrats ever voted against their own political party. A lot of people point to this and say, this is a serious problem. We don't have the men and women in Congress doing their own thinking such that the ideas we get out of Washington are not very helpful. So there you see how that partisanship really plays out. Now let's go back to the idea of representation. There are essentially four kinds of representation, and we're going to go through each one. The first is policy representation. Policy representation is kind of what you would consider traditional representation. Congressmen and women work to advance the issues that are the preferences of their constituents. So if you are a senator from Georgia, you're going to work to help peach farmers. If you are a representative from Detroit, you're going to work to help auto manufacturers. Those are policy representations. Now, oftentimes going along with this is what we call allocative representation. With allocative representation, men and women in Congress work to secure money. This could be projects, which those would be jobs, services, or funds for their district. We oftentimes will refer to these as pork barrel projects. Pork barrel project is when you get money from all the taxpayers of America to fund a project in your local district. So if a member of Congress were to get a bridge built in his or her district using federal money, that bridge may not really help anyone else in the United States except the people who live in that place. That's an example of pork barrel spending. Now you will hear in the news there's a big push to get the pork barrel spending out of Washington, et cetera, but what generally happens is without getting pork barrel spending, without getting this money allocated to your local district, a lot of members of Congress cannot get reelected. So in as much as that is true, pork barrel spending continues to be rather popular with members of Congress. Two more types of representation that you will see from time to time. One is what we call casework. Now, not all people can call your representative or your senator and ask them to help you solve a problem. So if you need a passport and it's taking too long, you can call your representative or senator and have them help you. This is called casework. And there are people that work for senators and work for representatives who do this kind of work. The last kind of representation is symbolic representation. This is usually things that just kind of look good. These are efforts by members of Congress to stand for American ideals. So sometimes Congress will pass laws or statements, resolutions that are just there for show. They don't really have much force behind them, but they're there to show about what we believe as Americans. And generally speaking, not a lot of that kind of representation gets done. All right, so let's do our first question up here. Take a look at the different roles played by members of Congress and try to explain how these roles could potentially result in conflicts. Think here about conflicts between the constituents of a local area and the members of the country as a whole. Also think how this might result in conflicts between individual members of Congress. Take a few moments, answer this question, and when you are ready, hit play and keep going through the video. All right, now let's take a look at the specific powers of the House and the Senate. First, understand that we have what is called a bicameral legislature. Bicameral means two houses or two chambers. And in the Constitution, these two chambers, the House and the Senate, are treated differently. We're going to go through some of those differences as we better understand how Congress functions. Here is a chart, and this is repeated in your notes, that really breaks down a lot of the main differences. First, term length. In the House of Representatives is only in there for 2 years. Every 2 years, if you're a member of the House of Representatives, you have to be re-elected. We do this on purpose so that the House of Representatives, if you don't like your representative, you can get rid of that person, and they're only going to be in there for 2 years anyway. We let you be younger. If you're in the House of Representatives, you can be 25. So the House is really a place where politics can get rather hot rather quickly because everyone in there is always trying to get reelected. This is opposed to the Senate. In the Senate, your term length is 6 years. So you're in there for substantially longer. You're in the Senate for longer than the president serves. You have to be a little bit older. You have to be 30. You need to be a bit wiser, and you're supposed to be a bit smarter in the Senate than in the House. There are some other differences, such as with impeachment. The House of Representatives will impeach someone. That means they will find, let's say, a president. They will charge the president with an impeachable offense. Then the Senate is where that person would be tried. In order to actually be thrown out of office, you have to be both impeached and then tried and found guilty in the Senate. And that has never actually happened for a U.S. president in the history of the United States. The House of Representatives has no authority over making treaties with other countries, and it has no authority over who the president will add to the cabinet or add to other executive branch agencies. The Senate, on the other hand, does have approval over treaties and presidential appointments. So the Senate does a lot of really, really important, long-lasting work, whereas the House doesn't do quite as much of that, and they are constantly reelected. The House is much, much larger than the Senate. The House has 435 members, and this is based on the populations of the state. The Senate has 100. And this is based on the number of states, and every state has 2 senators. So the membership in the House of Representatives can go up or down. Membership in the Senate is always 100, or it is always 2 senators per state. If we were to add a state, this membership would have to increase. The House and the Senate both have committees. The House has 20 standing committees, the Senate only 16. The House has what we call a Rules Committee that helps guide legislation through the House, whereas the Senate does not. And in the House of Representatives, there are limits on floor debate, meaning you cannot just continually talk forever. You have to eventually vote on a bill. In the Senate, you don't have that. You have what is called a filibuster, which is where you are allowed to just perpetually, literally perpetually, sometimes for days, weeks on end, make speeches about a bill and try to block it being passed. So there are some of the key kind of basic differences between the House and the Senate. Now, let's take a look at the checks and balances system between Congress and the President. First, Congress passes the bills, but the President can either sign or veto them. So though Congress is making the legislation, the President has the final say as to whether something becomes a law. In the President's State of the Union address, which happens every January, he will explain to the country the policies he wants to set. And then it will be up to Congress to try to, the idea is they would try to make the laws that the President wants to see. Now, while the President executes the laws, Congress will also oversee the President's offices. So the Congress will look at what the presidential executive branch is doing and to make sure that it is following the laws that have been set. The President will appoint his or her cabinet, and in addition to that, the President can also appoint ambassadors, judges to federal level courts, and then the Senate can advise and consent to that. Now, what is interesting is that the President represents the entire country. But as we talked about previously, Congress only represents their districts or their states. So sometimes you can see a real conflict between the Congress, who is always trying to do things for their own state, and the President, who's trying to do things for the entire country. And which party is right in that particular case kind of depends on the issue sometimes. All right, now let's take a look at the relationship between Congress and the judicial branch. As we know, Congress makes the laws, but the judicial branch, the courts, interpret those laws. So many times Congress will make vague laws. They will give a general policy idea, and the job of the courts is to specifically interpret what those laws mean. Furthermore, Congress has the job of setting up the federal courts. The only court that is specifically addressed in the Constitution is the Supreme Court. Congress is given all other power under the Constitution to set up whatever other federal courts need to exist. They also get to do things like determine the salaries of those members of the federal judicial branch. The Congress also decides the jurisdiction for these courts. So jurisdiction describes the types of cases courts are allowed to hear, and Congress determines what jurisdiction particular courts will have, which gives Congress a fair amount of control over the courts if it so chose. If it chose to remove certain types of issues away from the jurisdiction of the courts, then it would be impossible for those courts to make rulings on that particular type of issue. In this way, Congress does pass legislation that will limit the court's discretion. In particular, the Congress has shown interest lately of imposing limits on what kind of sentences can be passed down for certain crimes and to limit the jurisdiction certain courts have over certain types of cases. So in this way, Congress can override the judicial branch at times, but as we'll see later, the judicial branch also has its own ways of enforcing its will on the Congress. So, question. How does Congress interact with the other two branches? Give me 2 examples of interactions with each other branch. So 2 examples of how it interacts with the judicial branch and 2 examples of how it interacts with the executive branch. Easy question here. Take a few minutes, write that out. When you're ready, resume the video. Moving on. Electing people to Congress is a tricky process that is filled with politics and can be at times very intense. A lot of politicking goes into getting people elected to Congress because Congress is a very important piece of the government and members of Congress have a lot of power. So, every 10 years following the census, there is a reallocation of congressional seats. What this means is some states will lose members in the House of Representatives. Other states will gain members in the House of Representatives based on whether or not those states have gained or lost population over the last 10 years. So as you can guess, states like Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Indiana, states that used to have a lot of manufacturing jobs have lost a lot of people in the past 20 or 30 years, and as such, we have lost members of Congress. This is shown on the flip side by places like Arizona, New Mexico, North and South Carolina gaining a lot of those people, and those states are adding members of Congress. So the more members of Congress you have, you can see that makes your state more or less powerful. The process of redrawing these district lines is called redistricting. Now, this is usually done on a state-by-state level. So in Ohio, the Ohio legislative branch will redraw district lines every 10 years. The Republicans in Ohio have controlled the Ohio House of Representatives and Ohio Senate for a long time, and every census they keep redrawing district lines to help Republican members of the Ohio legislature get reelected. That is a process called gerrymandering. Gerrymandering is where you redraw district lines to benefit a particular group of people, usually to benefit a particular political party. So drawing the lines of congressional districts is not something many people know about, but much of the power of Congress comes from where these district boundary lines fall. There are a few types of gerrymandering. First is pro-incumbent gerrymandering, where you can draw a district line around a new congressional district that is more likely to elect a particular person. This is what we generally call partisan gerrymandering. So this is where the majority party in a given state, such as Ohio, will draw district lines in a way that will maximize the number of House seats that party can win. This has been happening for a long time, and every time it's done, it is a controversial idea. Because if you are the party in power in the state of Ohio, you can determine who Ohio will send to the federal Congress by drawing district lines in such a way that you can almost guarantee a certain electoral result. Another kind of gerrymandering is what we call racial gerrymandering. Racial gerrymandering is where you attempt to redistrict to either enhance or reduce the chances that a particular racial or ethnic group will be elected into the legislature. We did a lot of this after 1982. The new iteration, or the 1982 iteration of the Voting Rights Act, was an attempt to get what we call majority-minority districts, where you would draw district lines around neighborhoods that were heavily African American or heavily Latina in order to get members of those racial or ethnic groups elected to Congress. This, however, has been deemed unconstitutional by the Supreme Court, and it is now no longer a practice that is permitted. If you take a look here, this is a fascinating example of gerrymandering. This is, if those green lines are the 4th Congressional District in Illinois. You'll notice one glaring thing about it is that those two pieces don't even touch each other. So you can be in the north part of the 4th Congressional District or the south part and still have the same representative. This was a line drawn in order to maximize Democrats' chances of winning in this area of Illinois. So that's the kind of ridiculous boundary line that will be drawn in states where you allow the majority party in the state legislature to draw the district lines. Here it is in Ohio presently. If you look at the image on your left, that is the old congressional district lines in Ohio. A few interesting things to note here. Take a look at district number 9. It is green on both of those maps. In 2010, before the new district lines were drawn, 9 was a fairly significant piece of land stretching from the west side of Cleveland almost all the way into Toledo. Now, under the new district lines, you can see that, that the 9th district is very, very tiny. It's just the people living on Lake Erie on the west side of Cleveland stretching out all the way to Toledo. It is not a very logically drawn district, but Republican representatives in the state of Ohio drew that line to minimize the chances that to minimize the chances that a Democrat could get elected in the new 4th district, which is that purple district that you see there. So as you can see, a lot of these lines don't make a lot of sense geographically, but rather they are drawn in a way so as to help the majority party get more and more power. That's why many people are strongly against allowing the state legislature to continue drawing these lines because of what they will do. Instead, there's a movement in Ohio and other states to push for a nonpartisan way of redistricting such that more groups are more fairly represented. Question. Explain gerrymandering and discuss why it might be harmful to our notion of representative democracy. Really think this through. What are the consequences of gerrymandering? Explain in no less than a full paragraph. Take a few minutes and do that. Pause the video now. Restart it when you are ready. Moving on to running for Congress. First, think about this. Why would you want this job? This job is hard to do. It doesn't pay that well compared to a lot of other jobs you could do. It is very hard work. You have to constantly be getting reelected, and the odds of you being tossed out of office or not reelected are kind of high. It is expensive to run for office. It is tough. People do this job first because they feel a love of country or a love of their state and they want to get out there and represent the people and serve the public. Some people want to have this job for one idea. Let's say they are just very much into stopping global warming. They will try to get elected and do as much as they can about this one thing. So lots of people do this job for different reasons. You need to understand that some people are very strategic about this. We call these people strategic politicians. These are people who will base his or her decision on the calculation as to whether or not you will be successful. This is opposed to people who are more idealistic and want to get out and push their message no matter what. A lot of politicians are kind of cool, calculating individuals. They will wait until the time is right to run. They will do research with focus groups and research with polling data, and they will really try to scientifically boost their chances of getting reelected or elected the first time. So who does get elected? Not who you would think. Congress does not look like the people. The people of America are a highly diverse group. Congress is not. Most of Congress is white. They are generally men. They're generally over the age of 40, and they are generally rich. That is not really what America looks like. And there are all kinds of reasons for that, stemming from basic racism to more sophisticated issues related to gerrymandering and other issues relating to the suppression of voter turnout. So Congress does not look like the people. This brings us to an idea that we should have what's called descriptive representation. This is the notion that the people who are elected should look like the people you're representing. This is not the reality in the United States. If it were, then about 12 or 13% of the Congress would be African American. Half of them roughly would be women. 10% of them roughly would be gay. We just don't have that in the United States. Some people view that as a very serious problem. If you take a look here, this is the House apportionment for elections between 2012 and 2020. You can see some states lost seats, including Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, etc. Some states gained seats like Texas, Arizona, Utah, Florida, South Carolina, and a lot of states just kind of stayed the same. So remember, after every census, we're either adding or losing seats all across the country. And as we do that, that shifts the power and shifts the control of the country around geographically. All right, so how does Congress really work? First, remember, most members of Congress are highly partisan. They vote with their other party members. The majority party controls the leadership, and the leadership in the House and the Senate determines what gets done. So if you want to be an important member of Congress, it's not enough to just get elected. You have to also make the people in your party happy, so they will give you what you need in order to do your job. Here you can see who has been in control of the House of Representatives from 1925 to nearly the present day. The red line are Republicans, the blue line are Democrats. You can see here that as you bounce around with numbers in the House of Representatives, 1936-37, we had almost all Democrats. So there were so many Democrats you couldn't even find a Republican. Now we're much closer. Now the party split is about 234 or so Republicans to about 201 or so Democrats. That party division means that the Republicans are in control now, but they can't just do whatever they want. So though they're in charge, they don't have a super majority. They have a slim majority. And this slim majority means getting stuff done is not always possible. All kinds of different party differences between House candidates. Here you can kind of take a look at what defines being a Democrat or a Republican. If you are more pro-choice and you want to increase income taxes on the rich, if you want to ban assault rifles, if you want to legalize citizenship for illegal immigrants, and if you tend to support military action in Afghanistan, you tend to be a bit more democratic. If you believe that there should be a ban against gay marriage, if you want to cut what are known as capital gains taxes, these are taxes that capital gains are gains that you make on stock sales and things like that, which are generally helpful for wealthy people. If you would cut spending on welfare, if you want to privatize Social Security, meaning get the government out of retirement savings, and do you want to just generally reduce the government regulations on businesses, then you tend to be a Republican. So if you take a look there and start to think about what your ideas are, you can kind of begin to see which of these two parties you may agree with. So back to the organization. First, the Speaker of the House is the presiding officer. The Speaker of the House is very, very powerful. He or she has more power in the House than does the majority leader in the Senate. The Speaker of the House will determine what laws come to the floor for a vote. If a law doesn't come to the floor for a vote, it is not going to become a law. It stays a bill. And the Speaker of the House determines that. We have had only one female Speaker of the House. That was Nancy Pelosi. All other Speakers of the House have been white men throughout the entire history of the country. The leadership power of this person depends on who he or she is and how much power he or she can take from the rest of the party. It is a viciously political position with a lot of potential for backstabbing and hurting the other people around you. Now, you have to understand that in Congress there are things known as committees. Committees are where the work of Congress gets done. There are permanent standing committees that are responsible for particular policy areas. So you have a Ways and Means Committee that talks about taxing and spending. You have a Military Affairs Committee. You have an Environmental Committee. These committees are there to determine what legislation about those particular policy areas should get passed. Those committees are all led by a chairperson. The chairperson has huge power. So if you want to get a new tax rate passed through the House Ways and Means Committee, you got to go talk to the committee chair of that committee. And if he or she doesn't like the idea, you're dead in the water. Your idea just cannot happen. So as you can see, not all of the power in Congress is apparent. It's not all on the surface. And not all members of Congress are the same. If you're a member of Congress, but you're not on one of the big, powerful committees, you're simply less important than other members of Congress. The Rules Committee is probably the most important of the House committees. A rule in the House of Representatives is a term meaning a term deciding when a bill will be argued in front of the entire Congress. Being on the Rules Committee means you get to set the agenda. You get to help determine which bills will be debated and which will not. If a bill never gets debated, then it might as well have never even existed. And the Rules Committee has the power to crush bills and never let them see the light of day. There are also select and joint committees that are there to do very specific things that standing committees generally don't do. These tend to be specialized, sometimes temporary things that need looked into. There are conference committees. Conference committees are temporary committees that are there to bring members of the House and Senate together in order to rewrite legislation so that both the House and the Senate versions of a bill are identical. The president doesn't vote on two versions of a bill. The president has to vote on one version that's been passed through both the House and the Senate. And over time, the resources given to Congress in terms of members of staff and the bureaucracy have grown considerably because their work is so complicated. Question: explain the importance of the committee system, and then tell me, is this good or bad? Is the committee system a positive thing or a negative thing for lawmaking in the United States? Take a moment, pause the video, and when you are ready, resume. All right, so let's talk about how Congress works in greater depth. First, you have to understand that Congress is a procedural place. So politics and procedure work together. Each house in the Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, need to pass the same bill. Committees will break down legislation, and then a conference committee will bring the legislation back together. It has to pass both sides in the same wording in order to move on to the president for his or her approval. Now, what becomes a law is the real trick. If you want something to become a law and you are the president, you just tell Congress what you want. Sometimes this works out, sometimes it doesn't. It depends on the politics between the president and the House of Representatives and the Senate. The other way is through legislative procedures, where members of Congress will introduce bills, then move them up through committees. Most bills don't make it out of committee. Most bills go to a committee and stay there, and they're never argued on again. They're never seen again, and that's the end of that bill. So there's really two ways around that. After the House has ruled from the Rules Committee that a bill can be argued, it goes to the floor of the House where the entire House can debate and then vote on the bill. The Senate has a similar procedure where the bill will go to the Senate, and then senators have this strange option called a filibuster, where if you don't want to allow a vote to occur on a bill, you can filibuster it. You can just stand up, start talking. You can literally talk forever. And this is done as a means to stop bills that certain senators do not like. Now, if a vote of cloture is taken, and cloture is on the screen there for you, with a supermajority, a 2/3 majority of the Senate, they can tell that senator who is filibustering that he or she must stop, and then a vote would happen. But no party has had 2/3 of the Senate in quite some time. So votes of cloture are difficult to obtain. And what this means is that in the Senate, a filibuster is a law killer. If one senator does not like a bill, he or she can filibuster it and it will never become a law. There is a final challenge, which is the final consideration by the House or the Senate. You also have the power to, the president has the power to veto. The president can veto a bill, and if he or she vetoes the bill, Congress then has one final try. Congress, if both houses of Congress vote with a 2/3 supermajority, they can override a presidential veto. That happens very, very rarely, but it is one important check on the power of the president, is that if the president vetoes a very popular piece of legislation, Congress can override that veto. Here's how a bill becomes a law, just a short version. There's a larger version in your book, but essentially you see what I just described right there in front of you. This brings us back to why we don't like Congress. First, Congress doesn't do much. Congress doesn't do a lot of lawmaking, despite the fact that that is the job of Congress. Beyond this, congressional campaigns are highly negative. When two people are running for Congress, they just tear each other apart. And when they tear each other apart, people get turned off from politics. Add to this an almost constant stream of congressional scandals and negative media coverage of Congress. It means that we just don't like the people who are making our laws. Leading us back to the broader question of, if we don't like them, then why don't we get rid of them? Just vote them out. But remember, while most Americans very much dislike Congress, most of us like our individual senators and congressmen. Now, we tend to be very dissatisfied with the politics. We tend to be very dissatisfied with the amount of money going from private individuals and companies into Congress. There's the appearance of, and sometimes the reality of, corruption there. Furthermore, congressional reforms a law needs to happen to reform Congress. Laws are not going to be passed through Congress because no one wants to reform themselves. So Congress is unlikely to reform itself, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. Leading us to our question. A very small percentage of us like Congress. Why? What does this mean in terms of these roles that Congress people play? What does it say that we really don't like our members of Congress very much? Take a few moments, explain that, pause the video, and then wrap it up.